In this edition of Big Picture, we will analyze the economic partnership between India and Australia. Prime Minister has called it a watershed moment. What does it mean for India-Australia ties, and where is it going to take trade relations? That's what we're going to analyze today. And joining me on the program to do just that are Jayant Dasgupta, former ambassador of India at the WTO, Dr. Ajay, former Commerce and Industry Secretary, Government of India, and Ambassador Gurjit Singh, retired career diplomat. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of Big Picture. Ms. Dua, let me start the program with you first. How would you look at this development? What does this really mean? Because, you know, like I mentioned earlier as well, the Prime Minister has called this a watershed moment. Why a watershed moment?
I think it's one of the first free trade agreements which we have signed in recent years, meaning first in the sense we signed one with UAE a couple of months ago. And so in the spate of the agreements which we've been negotiating, we've reached a degree of finalization. With Australia, we've been talking for over a decade. We had been, and now we've reached somewhere. And as you know, in this agreement, we have agreed to apply tariff reductions to 85% of the items of each side which are traded, which is a big number. Second, we've also covered some amount of, I wouldn't call it migration per se, exchange of manpower. Manpower also has been brought under it. And finally, I would say that it is a watershed kind of an agreement which the Prime Minister talks about, because it is an agreement with a Quad partner. Now, Australia has a special status vis-a-vis us, that we are together with it, Japan and the United States, and we already have an agreement with Japan. We've been negotiating for a while with the US, something should happen. And with Australia, it's now a good beginning. We don't have as yet an agreement with New Zealand, but with most other partners in the ASEAN countries. You know, the RCEP, which we didn't sign, but bilateral agreements which we have are with most of the countries in the ASEAN region already. And it was not so far, not with China or with Australia or New Zealand. So one more and a large country at it, with which we had a trade of $27 billion in annual trade. And we are hoping to build it up to $50 billion going forward.
Absolutely. Ambassador Gurjit Singh, let me bring you to the picture now. You know, so what does this really mean as far as India-Australia ties are concerned? And let's not forget, Australia and China in the past have been, trading heavily. Australia is still dependent on China, but of late we've seen some kind of, a friction between Beijing and Australia as well. So does this only ensure that India has a bigger role to play?
Certainly, I believe that this is a strategic agreement. And without the strategic intent, this agreement actually would never have taken place. It is frankly, Australia is no great trading partner. $27 billion is peanuts. UAE is a major trading partner. So And let's go back. RCEP, we all blame China. Actually, Australia was equally obdurate on many issues and was a big hurdle to India's participation in RCEP. But 2018, the Quad starts coming back. 2019, India pulls out of RCEP. 2020, the Australians go into an India Economic Strategy 2035, which was revised last month in March. So suddenly they start taking you more seriously for strategic intent, partly because you mentioned that they have trade issues with China. But you know, the Australia China trade can in no way be compensated with trade with India. So it is not that, but it is the intent. Now, there are three ways you can look at it. The first is the bilateral. So I think Australia looking at India far more seriously and saying as a Quad partner, as a strategic partner, and this strategic partnership was only announced in 2020, that now let's get on with it and let's do something. So without trade, where do you go? So you sign this ECTA, what we have signed now. And this will be followed by a more fulsome agreement, which regionally means that the ghost of the RCEP is buried. And we have signed an agreement beyond RCEP with Australia, most only on our terms, keeping out areas where Indian industry and agriculture were uncomfortable. Secondly, the supply chain resilience initiative, which India and Japan and Australia started to talk about, frankly has no meaning unless you have a preferential or free trade arrangement between you. So this enables the SCRI, whose terms and conditions are still not clear because the complementarities between Australia and India are very limited. But finally, I would say that Australia is today going to become a very important partner for critical elements, rare earths and all that, and for energy, because coal and LNG are both covered by ECTA. So I think this makes it very relevant for the time being.
Absolutely. Mr. Dasgupta, let me bring you in now. Like it has been mentioned by both the panelists, both large countries, India and Australia, but if you look at the trade between the two countries, there is so much of potential and there's so much more scope really as far as trade is concerned. What does this agreement now do for trade between the two countries? Can we see it going up?
Yeah, I think from the statements which have come from both the sides against about $27 billion of bilateral trade, it is expected to go up in the next few years to between 45 and $50 billion. So that is one part of it. If you analyze further, the Australian exports to India, which amounted to approximately $14 billion, now, $10 billion of that was basically coal or LNG or other mineral oil products. Now, and there were 3 billion odd for the other products. If you look at the concessions that India has given while protecting its core interests like dairy, like rice, wheat, apples, for instance, you will find that the Australians are quite happy because they will get access, for instance, in coal, LNG at zero duty from day one. The other thing is that, we are dependent on Australia for alumina, for various other mineral resources, which are not in great supply in other parts of the world also. So Australia is one of the few countries which has resources in that regard. So that will open up our unhindered access to Australian resources. The third point is that, and I think it needs to be flagged, there is a problem between Australia and China which has been simmering for quite some time. And despite RCEP, the Chinese have imposed certain restrictions on Australian exports, and it led to Australian goods stagnating in Chinese ports for many weeks, sometimes months on end. There is also another problem which the Australians face, though they are perhaps not very willing to articulate it. That is the large numbers of Chinese who are now, have permanent resident status, or who are going there to study and staying on and buying property in very, expensive neighborhoods, buying not only properties, restaurants, grocery stores, other means of livelihood. Now, that is, I think, something which the Australians have in mind. They would perhaps like also to counterbalance it with India. So in that light, you have to see this extension of post-education work visa from 2 to 4 years for Indian students. And mind you, Australia is a large recipient of Indian students every year.
Oh.
And then the last point is that in services, we have agreed that there would be, of course, migration of skilled not migration, but easy entry for skilled professionals like chefs and yoga instructors and other trades. That is one. The other point is that there would be mutual recognition processes initiated between the respective professional bodies for a wide range of professional services. Foremost amongst them, of course, would be perhaps accountancy, law, which are, many students are going from India to study these disciplines in Australia. So I think it will lead to a greater strengthening of the bonds that already exist between India and Australia. It would lead to much greater trade. And the Australians have also promised that India would be one of their foremost investment destinations in the next few years.
Absolutely. Mr. Dua, coming back to you now, you're making a point in your opening remark, and that's something that I want to take up with you as well. We've seen a spate of, economic pacts, agreements, FTAs, whatever you want to call them, of late. How do they help, and why are we seeing these agreements being worked out? What's really working in our favor that we are getting these through?
A couple of things, Frank. One, globalization, which was the kind of the flavor for the last 20, 25 years. That's taken a hit. First, President Trump's role in protecting, rightly or wrongly, the US interests. Second, his bilateral actions, call them retaliatory actions against many countries, including India. Steel, aluminium, we are well aware of, including filing a complaint against India at the WTO, which a body which he didn't let it function fully because he wouldn't appoint the appellate body, the requisite number of commissioners or the members who were wanted there. So that's a dispute resolution system of WTO he put at stake. Second, I would say the action of China. That has also, that in a major fashion has put people, when I say people, nations, basically I should be saying, nations on alert, saying China's military power actually flows from its economic strength. And in the economic muscle of their trade constitutes a very big, it's not a domestic driven economy, China. Increasingly, there is an emphasis towards it, but trade formed a very major. If China continues to pursue its, and I think I wouldn't be wrong if I were to use a hard word, so-called geographical ambitions, territorial ambitions, and kind of building up through its BRI initiatives and other kind of areas of influence around the world. So people have become wary, saying that how much support should we be giving to China through more trade in becoming militarily strong and be able to pursue goals which are not palatable to the rest of the world, and not just free world. The China has been threatening almost everybody which has been coming within its, or coming in the way of its pursuit of President Xi Jinping's, I would say, clearly demonstrable areas of influence which he's been pursuing. So that has made for the country like India, saying let's forget multilateralism for a while. Let's look at protecting our own interests. And if the world is going the bilateral way, we should start pursuing that. So it's a change of tact from what it was, say, till about 3 or 4 years ago, to what, say, maximum 5 years ago, to what it is now. If the world is drifting towards such bilateral agreements, regional agreements, etc., India can't be now talking only on those lofty aspects of multilateralism. And who benefited the most from multilateralism? My distinguished colleagues who are very knowledgeable in the subject would bear me out that China was the biggest beneficiary of so-called multilateralism. That they used this UN system, the WTO and other bodies to actually become economically strengthen themselves by getting into the field of trade. And their own manufacturing strength and other technological strength came because of their deals, because of the Americans, President Nixon onwards, what favors and others China got. So they were the beneficiaries both ways. So I would think that these two particular reasons
Absolutely
are the main ones. And of course, we are wary that we are reviewing our agreements, the earlier agreements with 4 or 5 countries which we had entered with, the FTAs, including one with Japan, the one with Korea, and we're also looking at one with South Asian countries. So we have to be careful. So I think we have learned. That's why now we talk about 85% of the products covered, protecting our remaining 15%, which are sensitive to us. Upfront, we tell them that we are not going to open up on those. And if you're looking at, and we also realize our strength, that we are a 1.4 billion size market in terms of number of people. And so if you will, market access is what Australia is seeking from us.
Absolutely.
So for whether it is for its sheep meat, whether it is for its wool, whether it is for minerals, other items and some processed foods, etc., it is we are giving them an opening to a very large market. Hence, we are able to now talk saying our strength is services, our strength is our people, so their movement, etc., has also to be covered in the agreements. It's not merely a merchandise.
Absolutely. Ambassador Gurjit Singh, coming back to you now, we have, like already been mentioned on this program, we have a comprehensive economic partnership agreement with Japan. We are trying to work out some kind of an FTA with the United States as well. We now have an agreement, a trade agreement, an FTA with Australia as well. So, if you look at the Quad and if you look at these 4 countries coming together, agreements like this, does it also ensure that it strengthens plurilaterals or multilaterals that these countries are a part of? Does it have, what I'm trying to say is, do these bilateral ties have any kind of bearing on multilateral as well?
Normally, yes. For instance, the India-Japan superb relationship has impacted a good Quad. But in the case of Australia, it is a good quad, which has actually impacted the bilateral engagement. But I think the India-Australia FTA is a good example for the UK, which has been dragging its feet and pretending to be a power which it isn't. So I think they need to learn from Australia the limits of their own power in their own perception. And secondly, the manner in which Australia has opened up to the free movement of people, this is something that the UK needs to understand. Secondly, Australia is not a big investor in India. Even under the economic strategy 2035, $210 million is set aside. The total bilateral investment between India and Australia, $20 billion. But Australia and the UK both need to realize that India's manufacturing sector needs huge investment. So their funds, their companies need to look at transfers of technology and strengthen India's manufacturing sector. And one of the reasons for FTA is that Indian manufacturing good will get duty-free access to Australia. So that becomes a cycle of investment, pulling back and all, which I think is a good thing. The other good thing which comes out of it, as I mentioned, the supply chain resilience initiative. That also came out of the Quad. But as I said, there were no complementarities with Australia. So now with rare earths and other things involved, the e-vehicle, that e-mobility area could become a good resilience point where India, Japan, and Australia could actually collaborate. Now, when we see the Australia-US economic partnership, Australia-Japan economic partnership, Japan-India, US-India, you will find how far back the Australia-India partnership is. So this is a very good first step. I would also like to say the role of China with regard to India and Australia has been played. Australia came strongly into the Quad, which led to strategic partnership and to this agreement. Here on, China has nothing to do with this. We are not a replacement for China. Tomorrow, if China relents, Australia will go back to trading with China in full measure. If the current government loses the election in Australia, you go back to a pro-China government, perhaps they will not unwind the relationship with India, but certainly they will rewind the relationship with China. So I think we should not overemphasize the China factor. We should look at building our bilateral engagement, which becomes an alternative, not a strong one right now, but an alternative nevertheless.
Very valid points there raised by you, Ambassador. Let me take those points forward as well with Mr. Dasgupta. Mr. Dasgupta, taking off from what the Ambassador just said, is this FTA going to have any kind of bearing on future FTAs or economic partnerships that we see with some of the other countries that we are trying to work out?
Yes, definitely. First, I must emphasize that this is part of our unfinished business because, as you know, in the RCEP negotiations, we already have an FTA with 10 of the ASEAN countries. We have one with Japan and one with Korea as well, so 12 out of the 15. With this, we complete 13 out of the 15. The other two are China and New Zealand, and I'm sure New Zealand will also follow before the year is over. So it will only leave out China, and for obvious reasons, there are problems in regard to China. So what we could not perhaps get out of the RCEP, of course, accumulation of value addition, within the RCEP membership is something which will be miss out on, but that could be obviated through other means. So this is part of that unfinished business. The second point is that this points in a direction which we have shown with the UAE FTA and with our talks progressing with the UK, that even if it is a developed country like Australia or UK, which of course are small economies, almost, the UK is almost the same as us now, and Australia is smaller. So we are, but the technological advancement and advancement in terms of various services is far more. So we are quite willing and eager to have bilateral trade relations placed on a different footing and have free trade agreements. So this will, of course, augur very well. And if we are then able to sew up the long pending negotiations with the EU, that would be the real icing on the cake.
Absolutely. All right, gentlemen, it's time to get quick closing comments now with the best way forward and what next. Starting first with you, Mr. Dua.
Frank, I think we should assiduously build up our relationships, bilateral relationships now with a lot of countries. And I think we are taking steps in the right direction. UAE can be a big partner. We are talking of $100 billion trade being reached with it fairly soon. Australia 50 odd. I would say that going forward, let's accept the situation that the way forward for quite some time is going to be bilateralism and work on it. We might have reached, and we discussed it in an earlier show with you, Frank, Jayant and I, that $400 billion export target, which we have made, is a good beginning, but we have a long way to go, considering that it still means $200 billion of trade deficit on the merchandise side alone. It's made up by services and other kind of stuff, but it is still a large one. And our domestic market certainly will grow, but looking at the economic recovery rates, if we have to get our GDP growing, it is not going to be alone domestic market, but we have to be getting a greater share of the world trade. We are a very small player in the world trade overall. So that will come about. Our FTAs in increasing number. Jayant mentioned one with EU, UK, Australia. I'm saying wherever we have an interest, we should be pursuing it now. Earlier, we were all expecting that let's slow down. Disadvantages have been more than advantages from the 3 or 4 FTAs which we had signed up earlier in the year. And let's look forward to developing the multilateral route. I think now that we know what is the situation on the ground, fortunately or unfortunately, we would have to go along the bilateralism. So let's not shy away from it, build it, and make trade an increasing portion of the increasing share of our GDP.
Absolutely. Ambassador Singh.
Thank you. So I think the strategic dimension of international economic relations is clearly posited by the India-Australia FTA. I think that path we should follow. We followed it for the UAE, we follow it here, and we must follow the strategic path with the UK and the EU. I think the USA is some time off. We must insist on an early review of the CEPA with Japan and ASEAN and put these trade, because otherwise your regional supply chains will remain perverted and not in our favor. And finally, I think the FTA is a very good example of how things can be done with speed, given the political will. And I think that lesson is something we should work on in a whole of government approach. Thank you.
And Mr. Dasgupta, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
I think Australia is a very natural trade partner because it has complementarities. It doesn't have a very large, well-established industrial manufacturing sector, for instance. It is strong in certain services, but it is very rich in natural resources. So it sort of fits the bill for an ideal trading partner for India. That is one. The second point I wanted to make is that the negotiations at the WTO in terms of providing additional market access, they seem to be stalled now for the past, let's say, since 1995, since the Uruguay round ended. So we must grab whatever opportunities we get to provide greater market access to our industries, to our services. And that is what we must look for. Australia is one step in that direction. UK would be another, New Zealand would be a third one, and of course, finally the EU, and at some stage, much later stage, the US. That would complete the circle. And Russia. We have concluded a joint study with Russia many, many years ago. And the Russians had said at that time, let us first see when we can enter the WTO, and then we would finalize this FTA. So that stage may also come within the next few years.
Absolutely. All right, gentlemen, we'll have to leave it at that. Thank you so much for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us.
Thank you.